I got diagnosed with ADHD when I was like 23, I believe. Got put on Adderall,
Hmm.
and I originally kind of came to that conclusion because a buddy of mine like gave me some of his Adderall, and he was just like, "Hey, you gave me like I know, super sketchy, illegal, allegedly." But
Yeah.
anyway, like he's just like, "Hey, I think you should try this because I think you might have ADHD. I want to see if it helps." And so he gave me some, and like I tried it for like 2 days. I was like, "Oh my god, oh my god!" It's like I just awoke from the Matrix. Like
But
I was so affected,
but what
and it
but
wasn't
but what happened? Like what happened? Like
like
what?
when I
I'm
took
very
the ADHD.
yeah. I'm very I want to know like what actually happens to people when they take Adderall.
Well,
Curious about
there's 2
this.
things with it. Okay, so there's
Yeah.
2 things. When you've never taken an amphetamine before,
Hmm.
you're gonna have this, like, blissful high, and you're just gonna be like because you're just gonna you feel good, you have all this dopamine, like, you gotta also understand, like, people like you and me have ADHD, like, we have a deficit of dopamine. Like, we've
Hmm.
got basically leaky plumbing, like, the dopamine doesn't go the neurotransporters don't go to the right place. It's very inefficient. So if you think about it as like, instead of like most people having like a rifle, like, and shooting dopamine from one neurotransmitter to another, and it gets there very effectively and efficiently, we've got like a shotgun where like a buckshot where like some of the bullets go on the target, but a lot of them go all over the place. And it's just not effective. So what happens is that Adderall is 2 things, like, it is a releaser of dopamine, and it also is a dopamine reuptake inhibitor, which basically means that it slows down and inhibits your body's reuptake of the dopamine, so basically think of it as like a leaky pipe,
It stays in
and
your
you're like
system longer, something like that.
yeah, 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 so you're able to
Oh, okay.
utilize that, dopamine for a longer period of time, so, like, for me what that basically did was make it so that I was able actually to focus, so part of the things with ADHD for me is I would
Oh,
be like,
okay.
"Okay, this thing," and then, for example, doing your taxes, or, like, for example,
Yeah.
writing a difficult email, like, a
Yeah.
difficult
Yeah.
email,
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
sit there and I'd be like, "Man, I don't know how to explain this." And you gotta sit there and you gotta think through it all. And like writing an email, I would sit there and I'd rewrite it. I'd rewrite it. I'd rewrite it because this isn't good. I'd sit there and I'd do for like an hour, I'd rewrite an email. But then when you're on Adderall, you're just like, okay, this is what I
Hmm.
want to say. Read it over one more time. Okay, the sun set. Go. Because
Wow.
like you have enough dopamine to be able to follow through and not feel the weight
Uh
of
huh.
a lack of dopamine. So dopamine for
Hmm.
me, how it's manifested with my ADHD is like, okay, well, this, you know, I'm doing this thing, I'm bored. And then like I don't have the ability to concentrate on something, but then I'm like, oh, I'll get a notification on my phone. Okay, fuck, okay, that's interesting. And then I'll go to check the notification now. And then the notification will say something. And then I'll like check my messages, be oh, okay, somebody
Hmm.
texted me something. I'll get to that. And then I'm like, fuck, okay, I'm hungry. Okay, I'm gonna go downstairs and I'm gonna go do this. You're constantly going from one thing to the next because it's exciting. It's like a novelty. It's like you need something to give you dopamine.
Hmm.
Because otherwise, like you have a deficit of it and you just feel like depressed and like sad and like you just feel like bored really and
Hmm.
like you just can't follow through. You just like I don't want to deal with this right now. And so you're looking for something more interesting. But when you take Adderall, there's 2 things. Like the first time I took it, it was like this euphoric high. Like, oh my God, I feel amazing. I didn't realize like what I was lacking. And that's how a lot of people get addicted.
Mm.
But that once you build some tolerance, that goes away.
Mm.
But you but what it does do is make you focused and have the energy to be able to follow through on things. The dangerous trap
Yeah.
for me with that stuff is that it makes you very achievement focused. And you have so much like you now you can follow through on things, but because you can follow through on things, you can get like an extra bump every single time you accomplish something.
Hmm.
And it kind of it's almost like it puts blinders on
Mm.
where like that's the way the longer I was on Adderall and the more that I was um just building my business and doing all these things, it was almost like you got like things everything outside of your peripheral view, like
Hmm.
everything that just starts to blur,
Hmm.
and then it's almost like it just narrows and narrows and narrows and narrows, and then you just go down a straight path, and
Okay.
all you give a shit about is like achieving whatever thing.
Mm.
And like to me, I think back uh in horror at like some of the things that like I did or said just from like from a business perspective, just like I was so focused on whatever the fuck was in front of me and just doing that. I didn't realize like how I was coming off, or I didn't realize how that would affect me in other ways. Like I didn't give a shit if I didn't sleep at night. I didn't give a shit if I didn't like eat well. I didn't give a
Mm.
shit about any of this stuff because I'm just like, oh, I just need to work on this thing. And
Mm.
what happened is that that tied in
Mhm,
with,
mhm.
and there's people that I know that are on Adderall that have ADHD and they don't have any of these issues. Like they're chill,
Mm.
calm. But for me, that plus these really bad coping mechanisms of feeling like, okay, it's never good enough, or I constantly have to be working on something because like, I have to constantly be doing something because I have to like justify like things and like all of this all came together where I was just overworking myself and like just completely,
Mm.
tapping from an empty well. So fast forward, I got off Adderall when I left my business. I did the RV trip, and um, I had so much novelty, like, every day was new and stuff, I didn't really need it
Right,
because
makes
I was still
sense.
getting that natural kind of, like, kick from it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But then fast forward to, like, me coming back and, like, starting consulting and working again, like, when I came back to Dayton, um, it was difficult because now I was pressed with, like, having to do all these things that, drudging through the drudgery, like doing the boring shit, chop wood, carry water every day. Answering these emails that are kind of annoying, or doing this or doing that, or like having to have difficult conversations and thinking about how I had to do it. Like these are all things I just didn't want to do.
Mhm,
Most people don't want to do. But when you have ADHD, you're just like, oh, okay, I'm going to do this thing instead. And
mm,
so it got to the point where I would go through these crashes where I would just like work all day, all night
mhm.
for like days or weeks at a time. And then I would just emotionally be and physically be so exhausted. I would just crash and I would just be like depressed and my body would fail me. Like my body would just like I would get horribly sick. Usually it would be like usually it would be like sinus infections because like my sinuses would get so inflamed. Um but what ended up happening is my doctor noticing these my psychologist I would see noticing these signs
Mhm.
eventually was like, I yes, you have ADHD. Yes, you've got some of the other things, but I suspect that you may be bipolar
Hmm.
because he's like, I see these trends. And if it was just Adderall and just ADHD, you wouldn't be having like these periods of like staying up all night for days or weeks at a time and then like crashing, you know? So I'm just like, yeah, you might have a point. So like, I had never considered that. And
Mhm.
so I went to a psychiatrist, like, to answer your question, I went to a psychiatrist and I told him what my psychologist said. And, I told him, he's like, well, do you want to address the ADHD? Because at that point I wasn't on anything. I got off Adderall.
Mhm.
And he's like, do you want to address the ADHD or do you want to try and address the bipolar? I'm like, well, I've gone down the ADHD rabbit hole and like that's kind of a dead end for me. I exhausted most options.
Mhm.
Um, I did Ritalin, I did Adderall, I did several other things, and I did Strattera, which is a non-stimulant, and
Mhm.
that was not good at all for me.
Mm.
Um, just for me personally, my chemistry, it was not good. And it's funny because I went back and I did a thing called GeneSight, which is like a DNA test that sees how susceptible, like positive or negative, you are to certain psychiatric medications.
Mm.
All the ADHD medications, super like genetic negative disposition to, which is really
Mm.
interesting. Um, and so then he's like, "Well, okay, I'm gonna try you on a very low dose of Lamictal. Doesn't really have like a lot of side effects. Like, let's try it with, some people do, but it's not super common. Let's try you on that." And it was interesting.
Mm.
I tried it, no side effects, and I noticed after like a couple weeks, like I was just a lot more calm.
Really?
And it didn't, yeah, it didn't, it wasn't like an overly mellowing effect.
Mhm.
It just made me have a baseline that I didn't even know I.
Mm.
And what I mean
Okay.
by that is I didn't realize how turbulent my day-to-day life was. Like
Mm.
because I didn't have anything to compare it against. I didn't have anything to compare it against. So I didn't realize, but I realize now like it didn't change anything about my personality. It didn't change anything about me. Only that I wouldn't get worked up and I wouldn't like go down these like I gotta stay up all night doing all these things.
Mhm.
Now the impulse, the thought to do that was still there, but the compulsive need to do it was not there anymore. So I
Mhm.
that did give me the ability to have a buffer, a distance where I still would pull all-nighters, but it's because I felt like I had to or I was supposed to. But it
Mhm.
wasn't this like compulsive fucking like I can't not do it, you know? And then I also
Mhm.
just noticed I didn't have as many slumps as I used to. Like I still had physical
Mhm.
like because of my health conditions, like tiredness, but I didn't have this like down depression that I had dealt with before.
Mhm.
And so, that wasn't it didn't all entirely go away, but it got better. And I asked the people around me that like, "Hey, do you notice something?" They're like, "Oh yeah. Oh, we noticed a change." And so I ended up going on a slightly higher dose. I'm still on a fairly normal dose, but like we kind of upped it slowly over time, and it's it's been really impactful for
Mm.
me. And I just think back at like how much abuse I put my body and my mind and like everything through my 20s. And it's just because I was fucking manic and I was on a goddamn amphetamine, which was basically just acting as jet fuel for my manic cycle. So I'm just like,
Oh, okay,
yeah,
okay,
that's the
okay,
thing.
I get it.
It was
Okay,
it's super. So I'm just like that. That's what my frustration is. Is like I was seeing psychiatrists then.
okay,
Why the fuck like, did they not
yeah.
like, knowing, like, all my history, like, why and me being very upfront about, my lifestyle and everything else, like, I don't understand, like, now that I went through the TSM and I read the fucking character traits of somebody that has bipolar type
Mhm.
2, I'm type 2, not type 1. Type 1's a little more severe,
Mhm.
anybody listening that's interested in hearing about that, I did an episode with Oliver Seligman, a monk earlier in the awesome, awesome guy. But he talks about uh, what he experienced being he was a Merrill Lynch trader and then he went kind of had a nervous breakdown and then
Mhm.
ended up becoming a monk. Super interesting, but I hadn't experienced anything to that degree like he did. Like he literally jumped off a roof thinking he would fly, like he thought he was like Jesus or something. Like it was
Mm.
very extreme case compared to me, but think like knowing what I know now, it's like, how the fuck did the doctors I was seeing not see this or screen me for it or something? And it's like, it just makes me realize like how a lot of these doctors are just checked the fuck out.
Yes.
And it's just like, it's
Yes.
insane. Like I think
Yeah.
back at like, look, I wouldn't change anything. I wouldn't even change anything with the autoimmune condition because this is something that like comes up time and time again in Mate's books, the four books I've read from him. They all say the same thing, which is like this illness, this chronic illness that I'm dealing with, or this addiction that I'm dealing with, either or. And sometimes it's the same for people that overlap.
Mhm.
It's caused me to have to like slow down and look at myself and
Mhm.
have to work on myself. And like I realized if I wouldn't have had like this health condition, I don't think I ever would have slowed down, you know?